Tonight we begin with a decision that American defense officials had debated for months, that British military planners had advocated for repeatedly, and that Ukrainian commanders had desperately awaited. A decision that unfolded not over extended diplomatic negotiations, but in a single coordinated announcement. A single announcement that unlocked weapons systems previously considered too escalatory. A single announcement that gave Ukraine authorization to strike targets deep inside Russian territory. A single announcement that, within hours, resulted in missiles striking farther into Russia than at any point in this war. What Washington and London did today crossed a threshold that the Kremlin had explicitly warned against. And when that threshold was crossed, Ukraine did not hesitate. They responded with speed, with precision, and with strikes so deep into Russian territory that sirens sounded in regions that had never before heard them during this conflict. For many months now, there had been discussions, not public announcements, not formal policy statements, just discussions that the United States and United Kingdom were reconsidering their restrictions on how Ukraine could use Western weapons. The Western alliance has been supportive, yes, but they have been restrictive in their support. Their weapons transfers have followed a certain logic, a caution, almost a doctrine of graduated escalation, designed to help Ukraine defend itself without provoking Moscow's most extreme responses. But what set off urgent deliberations in Washington and London this month was that the caution was no longer serving its intended purpose. Defense officials who monitor battlefield conditions know the indicators. The increasing range of Russian attacks on Ukrainian cities. The movement of Russian military assets to positions just beyond Ukrainian strike range. The establishment of logistics hubs in areas Ukraine couldn't reach. The growing sanctuary Russia enjoyed on its own territory. All of that had become strategically untenable. And whenever the restrictions designed to prevent escalation instead enable Russian advantage, it means something has to change. For months, Russia had exploited the boundaries of Western weapons authorizations. They positioned command centers, ammunition depots, and staging areas just beyond the range that Ukraine was permitted to strike. They launched devastating attacks on Ukrainian civilians, then retreated to safety across an invisible line that Western policy had drawn. They turned Russian territory into a sanctuary from which to wage war. This week, the United States and United Kingdom decided that sanctuary would no longer exist. Early this morning, the Pentagon and the British Ministry of Defence issued what they described as updated guidance on the authorized use of Western-provided weapons systems, including explicit permission for strikes on military targets inside Russian territory that had not been granted at any point in this 3-year conflict. These are the kinds of authorizations that Washington and London only issue when they are signaling something very specific. A fundamental shift in strategy, acceptance that previous restrictions had failed, or a determination that the risks of Russian escalation are now outweighed by the military necessity of allowing Ukraine to fight effectively. Kremlin observers didn't know which calculation had driven the decision, or whether all three factors had converged simultaneously. But what they did know was that the rules of engagement had fundamentally changed. And when the two most powerful NATO members change the rules of engagement without diplomatic warning, even by the smallest degree, every military command in the world pays attention. The authorization was remarkable in its scope. Ukraine was now permitted to use ATACMS missiles, the long-range American systems with a range of nearly 300 kilometers, against targets inside Russia. Ukraine was now permitted to use Storm Shadow cruise missiles, the British-French systems capable of precision strikes at even greater distances, without the previous geographic restrictions. Ukraine was now permitted to strike the command centers, logistics hubs, and staging areas that Russia had positioned just beyond previous reach. The message was unmistakable: the sanctuary is over. Within hours of the authorization being confirmed, Ukrainian commanders began implementing plans that had been prepared months in advance. They had known exactly what targets they would hit. They had known exactly when they would strike. They had only been waiting for permission. And today that permission came. The authorization issued by Washington and London today was not routine. It was not incremental. It was not a marginal adjustment to existing policy. It was transformative. Defense officials speaking after coordinated briefings described the decision as long overdue, strategically necessary, and perhaps most importantly, a recognition that previous restrictions had enabled Russian aggression rather than constraining it. But authorizations only matter if they are used. Ukraine used them immediately. In fact, their response today was among the most extensive strike operations we have witnessed in the entire conflict. Here's what we know. Within hours of the new weapons authorization being confirmed, Ukrainian forces launched a coordinated strike campaign reaching deeper into Russian territory than ever before. These weren't the limited cross-border operations we've seen in recent months. These were full-scale precision attacks using advanced Western weapon systems, strikes that Ukraine only conducts when they are implementing a comprehensive strategic plan. The targets were not chosen randomly. They had been identified, analyzed, and prioritized long ago. Ukrainian military intelligence had been tracking them for months. And the moment authorization came, the missiles flew. Multiple sources confirmed strikes on military facilities in the Kursk region, in Belgorod Oblast, and for the first time in areas of Russia that had never before been targeted by Ukrainian forces. The war had arrived in parts of Russia where citizens had previously felt safely distant from the conflict. That distance no longer exists. Tonight, Ukrainian military command confirmed that their forces launched precision strikes on Russian military infrastructure across at least 5 oblasts, including a major air base in the Lipetsk region that had served as a launching point for devastating glide bomb attacks on Ukrainian cities. Ukraine struck before Russia could disperse the aircraft. They hit command bunkers housing senior Russian Air Force officials. They hit ammunition storage facilities that had been considered safely beyond reach. They hit staging areas where Russian forces had been massing for planned offensive operations. In other words, Ukraine targeted the architecture of Russian aggression, the infrastructure that had enabled Russia to rain destruction on Ukrainian civilians while remaining immune from retaliation. This is what made the Western authorization so significant. The previous restrictions weren't just limiting Ukraine's options, they were actively enabling Russian strategy. They represented the kind of self-imposed constraint that allowed Moscow to fight with impunity. And Ukraine, understanding that dynamic completely, acted the moment restrictions were lifted. Not recklessly, not indiscriminately, but with surgical precision. They didn't strike population centers. They didn't target civilian infrastructure. They hit military air bases, with strikes so accurate that satellite imagery shows individual aircraft destroyed on runways. They hit logistics facilities with missiles that triggered secondary explosions lasting hours. They hit command nodes with weapons that decapitated Russian operational planning in multiple sectors. Ukrainian defense officials released preliminary damage assessments that tell the story clearly. Where Russian bombers once prepared for missions, there are now craters. Where ammunition depots once supplied the front lines, there are now fires visible from space. Where Russian commanders once planned attacks in safety, there is now rubble. And here's where the story becomes even more consequential. Western intelligence officials now believe that Ukraine's immediate and devastating use of newly authorized weapons was designed to demonstrate precisely why the restrictions should never have been imposed in the first place. Moscow had assumed that Western caution would continue indefinitely, that the fear of Russian escalation would permanently shield Russian territory, that the sanctuary would remain inviolate regardless of what Russia did to Ukraine. But instead, the opposite happened. Washington and London didn't maintain the restrictions. They lifted them comprehensively, allowing strikes that were so immediate, so devastating, so clearly effective that even skeptics in Western capitals were impressed. You don't get the attention of Washington's foreign policy establishment easily. But today, Ukraine did. Military analysts speaking with international media under condition of anonymity described Ukraine's strike campaign as proof of concept, a demonstration that the weapons work, that Ukrainian targeting is precise, and that the previous restrictions had been militarily counterproductive. But Ukraine proved something even more important today. They proved that lifting restrictions doesn't lead to the Russian escalation that many had feared. Their strikes were not only militarily effective, they were calibrated so precisely that they hit legitimate military targets while avoiding the civilian casualties that might have given Moscow propaganda victories. That precision matters because it validates the trust Washington and London placed in Ukrainian judgment. It shows that Ukraine is not recklessly striking into Russia. They are systematically degrading Russian military capability. And that degradation is exactly what the new weapons were intended to achieve. As reports continued coming in throughout the evening, we learned more about the extraordinary scale of Ukraine's deep strike operations. Ukrainian Air Force assets launched ATACMS missiles that struck air bases in the Kursk and Lipetsk regions, destroying aircraft and support equipment that had been used for attacks on Ukrainian cities. Ukrainian missile forces targeted logistics facilities that had been positioned just beyond previous authorized strike range, knowing they were safe from retaliation. Ukrainian special operations units coordinating with drone forces reportedly struck fuel depots used by Russian armored units operating near the border. Ukrainian naval drones operating in the Black Sea continued their campaign against Russian vessels, demonstrating that Ukrainian strike capability now extends in every direction. This wasn't just a response to new authorization. This wasn't just a demonstration of capability. This was strategic initiative, seized on a scale not seen since the liberation of Kherson. This was Ukraine showing what they could have done months ago, if only restrictions had been lifted sooner. And strategic initiative is the one thing Russia has struggled to maintain since the early weeks of this war. For every sanctuary Russia has established, Ukraine has now shown they can reach it. For every safe zone Russia has assumed, Ukraine has demonstrated it can be struck. For every assumption of immunity, Ukraine has delivered explosive contradiction. The pattern is unmistakable, and it is a pattern that changes the entire strategic calculus of the conflict. Remember, Putin thought Russian territory would remain safe throughout this war. He thought the threat of nuclear escalation would keep Western weapons at arm's length. He thought fear would prevent Ukraine from ever striking the Russian homeland. He thought the sanctuary would hold. But tonight the exact opposite is happening. Ukrainian missiles are striking deeper into Russia than at any point in the conflict. Western weapons are being used exactly as Ukraine has long requested. The sanctuary that protected Russian military operations no longer exists. And Putin's threats of escalation have proven to be the empty rhetoric that many analysts always suspected. This is not what the Kremlin planned. This is not what Russian strategic doctrine anticipated. This is not the outcome Putin was promised when he ordered the invasion. 3 years into this war, Russian territory is no longer safe. 3 years into this war, Russian air bases are burning. 3 years into this war, Russian commanders are evacuating facilities they thought were beyond reach. And based on the damage we're seeing tonight, Moscow genuinely does not know how to respond. What makes this moment so significant and so volatile is that the Western authorization happened at a time when Putin is under extraordinary pressure from every direction. Russian military commanders want revenge for the strikes on their bases. Russian nationalists want escalation and direct attacks on NATO. Russian oligarchs want the war to end before their remaining wealth disappears. Russian families want to know why the war has now arrived on Russian soil. Putin is attempting to balance these competing demands while facing a reality he never anticipated. Russian territory is now part of the battlefield. And when leaders in that position face humiliation on their own soil, they're not operating from strength. They're operating from crisis. They're operating from vulnerability. They're operating from a position where every option carries enormous risk. Tonight's strikes should be understood in that context. This is not just a military development. This is a political earthquake inside Russia. For 3 years, Putin told the Russian people that the special military operation was proceeding according to plan. For 3 years, he promised that Russia was winning. For 3 years, he assured them that the war would remain distant. Tonight, sirens sounded in Russian cities that had never heard them before. And that sound changes everything. The coordinated authorization from Washington and London, now formally documented in updated weapons guidance, was specifically designed to signal that Ukraine will have the tools it needs to fight effectively. Officials said explicitly that the new authorization was consistent with Ukraine's right to defend itself against Russian aggression. That is diplomatic language for, these strikes are legitimate, they are authorized, and we stand behind them completely. You don't usually hear that level of explicit endorsement from the Pentagon and Whitehall simultaneously, unless something genuinely historic is happening. The statements went further. They confirmed that additional weapon systems are being considered for similar authorization. They pledged that support would continue regardless of Russian objections. They explicitly stated that Russia's threats of escalation would not influence Western decision-making. And they warned Moscow that any attempt to retaliate against NATO for Ukraine's strikes would trigger responses of overwhelming magnitude. Behind closed doors, we're told that emergency consultations are ongoing between American and British military commanders about next steps. The goal is clear: ensure that the momentum of today's strikes is maintained and that Russia cannot re-establish sanctuaries beyond Ukrainian reach. Putin wanted the West to fear escalation. Instead, the West has decided that Russian escalation threats are no longer credible. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy addressed his nation and the world in a triumphant, emotional speech tonight. He said, "Today, justice reached places it had never reached before. Today, our defenders struck the facilities that have been used to murder our people." He said, "We are grateful to our partners for trusting us with these weapons. We have proven that trust is warranted." And he said, "Every Russian air base that launches attacks on our cities is now a legitimate target. Every depot that supplies missiles to kill our children is now within our reach. This changes everything." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a wartime leader who has watched his cities bombed, his people murdered, and his nation bled for 3 years while being denied the weapons to strike back effectively. When Zelenskyy speaks of justice tonight, he speaks of something he can finally deliver. When he speaks of reach, he speaks of capability that his forces demonstrated today in devastating fashion. Tonight, that capability rewrote the rules of this war. Here's what makes the situation even more volatile. Russia's response to today's strikes hasn't been isolated to rhetoric. Along with Kremlin statements condemning the Western authorization, Russian strategic forces conducted unannounced alert exercises. Russian cyber units launched intensified attacks against Ukrainian infrastructure. Russian state media began explicitly discussing nuclear options in ways not heard in months. Russian military officials threatened to expand targeting of Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. All of this happened within hours of the Ukrainian strikes becoming public. When Moscow moves multiple pieces at once in response to a battlefield development, it means an escalatory cycle may be beginning. Intelligence officials are now working to determine whether Russian responses represent genuine preparation for retaliation or psychological operations designed to deter further strikes. But in the context of deep strikes on Russian territory, the distinction becomes critically important. Moscow may feel compelled to respond in ways that demonstrate its own capability. And any Russian response carries the risk of triggering further Ukrainian action. This is the escalation dynamic that Western officials have long feared. But Washington and London have apparently concluded that the alternative, allowing Russian sanctuary to continue, was even more dangerous. Intelligence analysts are now considering several possibilities for what comes next. One is that Russia will accept the new reality that its territory is no longer immune and adjust its military positioning accordingly. Another is that Russia will attempt dramatic retaliation against Ukrainian cities to demonstrate that escalation has costs. A third possibility, the one generating the most attention in Western capitals, is that Russia will test NATO's resolve by threatening direct action against the Western countries that provided the weapons. But today, Ukraine demonstrated that threats will not deter them from using the weapons they've been given. They didn't wait to see how Russia would respond. They didn't hesitate out of fear of retaliation. They didn't limit their strikes to avoid provoking Moscow. They struck hard. They struck deep. They struck comprehensively. And in doing so, they demonstrated that the era of Russian sanctuary is definitively over. What comes next depends on how Moscow processes this new reality. But Ukraine has made clear that regardless of Russian response, they will continue to use every weapon they've been authorized to use. What we're watching now is a test of deterrence theory in real time. Russia wants to see whether threats of escalation can restore the sanctuary it has lost. Ukraine wants to demonstrate that escalation threats will never work against a nation fighting for survival. The United States wants to prove that supporting Ukraine with advanced weapons doesn't lead to catastrophic escalation. And the United Kingdom wants to show that standing firm with allies is both morally right and strategically sound. These objectives are not always perfectly compatible. The risks of this new phase of the conflict are genuine and significant. But tonight, those risks appear to have been accepted as preferable to the alternative of allowing Russia to wage war without consequence. The test is ongoing. The results will unfold over the coming days and weeks. But the first data point is clear. Ukraine has struck deep, and Russia has not yet found an effective response. Tonight, we've heard from intelligence sources who are monitoring Russian command networks for signs of how Moscow is processing the day's events. They say there is genuine shock in Russian military communications about the scope of the strikes. They say Russian commanders were not expecting Ukraine to act so immediately after authorization was granted. And they say the strikes have triggered urgent discussions at the highest levels of Russian government about how to respond without triggering even more devastating Ukrainian attacks. But Ukraine is not waiting for Russian deliberation. In fact, Ukraine is preparing for continued operations. Their response today, immediate, overwhelming, and precisely targeted, sent a message to Moscow that the new authorization will be used to maximum effect. And it sent a message to Washington and London that their decision to lift restrictions was the right one. More importantly, it sent a message to the Russian people. A message that says, your government told you the war was far away, today it arrived at air bases across your country, tomorrow it may arrive closer still. That message may prove to be the most consequential of all. Because ultimately, this war will end when the costs become unbearable for those who started it. Today, those costs increase dramatically. As the night continues, we expect more details to emerge about the full scope of Ukrainian strikes and the damage inflicted on Russian military capability. But what we already know is that the Western authorization was used exactly as intended. It allowed Ukraine to strike targets that had been untouchable for 3 years. It demonstrated that Ukrainian forces can use advanced weapons with precision and effectiveness. And it proved that lifting restrictions doesn't lead to the catastrophic escalation that some had feared. What happens next will depend on how Russia responds in the coming days. If Moscow accepts the new reality, the military balance of the conflict has permanently shifted in Ukraine's favor. If Moscow attempts dramatic escalation, Washington and London have already made clear they will stand with Ukraine. They have shown they will provide the weapons Ukraine needs. They have shown they are not afraid of Russian threats. And tonight, for the first time in this conflict, Russia appears genuinely uncertain about its options. The Kremlin is quiet. Too quiet. And when Putin is quiet after strikes on Russian territory, it means he is calculating responses that carry enormous risk. It means he is facing a reality he never anticipated. Because tonight, Putin learned something that changes everything. Russian territory is no longer a sanctuary. Western weapons will be used without restriction on military targets, and Ukraine will strike as deep as necessary to defend itself. This story is far from over. But tonight one thing is absolutely clear. The authorization was granted. Ukraine acted immediately. And the war has entered a new and decisive phase. And we will be here, watching every development, analyzing every response, reporting every strike, as this transformation of the conflict continues to unfold.